இப்போ இதுக்கு நடுவில் நான் இப்போ தமிழில் பேச ஆரம்பிச்சேன். உங்களுக்கு ஒரு வார்த்தை புரியா. நான் இந்த மாதிரி ஏன் பேசிட்டு இருக்கேன்?
I followed every word.
We actually had a bunch of well-trained actors who went and presented symptoms.
So these people will go to various doctors and present, basically fake the symptoms and record the outcome.
Exactly.
Say I'm a kid in 8th standard and my teacher is teaching something which is as per the 8th standard textbook, but my learning level is a 4th grade level. It's basically Tamil or Greek to me, right? I have no idea.
See, at one level, we don't have a jobs problem because people in India can't afford to be unemployed. So the unemployment rate is actually very low. Denying education was something that was key to maintaining local power structures. One of the reasons we are over-centralized is because the founders of India, including Dr. Ambedkar, did not trust local elites to deliver public services to the marginalized.
Karthik, welcome to episode 3. I think in the previous 2 episodes, we first discussed the kind of overarching idea of accelerating India's development. And in last episode, we looked very closely at the structure of, financing, taxes, revenue, all of that, distribution between, center and state, and also how so much of expenditure is done by state and hence so much responsibility in some ways also lies with state. But in today's episode, I want to fix a little bit the agenda on करना क्या है ऑन ग्राउंड पे सब इकोनॉमिक एनालिस्ट बढ़िया ठीक है आप एकेडमी में करते हैं पॉलिटिशियन को अपना काम करना है, ब्यूरोक्रेट को अपना काम करना है, बट आम आदमी के हिसाब से हेल्थ अच्छी हो रही है कि नहीं हो रही है, एजुकेशन के ऑप्शन क्या क्या है, जॉब इज अ ह्यूज प्रॉब्लम सो ऑन. एंड आई नो second half of your book you have pretty rigorous both analysis, commentary on what is happening in the country and what are the possible solutions. And it's not necessarily very prescriptive. It's like, way of thinking about some unique insight, which policymakers, etc. can look into that. So it'll be great to, cover some of those areas. But I want to, again, somewhat a macro question is, do you think there is this whole, flow of ideas from economics to into policy? Is that, do you see there's a more receptivity, people are listening, people are able to act on it? Like, do you see good evidence so that economists like you and others, do you have reason to feel optimistic कि वो सरकार सुन रही है और कुछ अच्छे आइडिया कुछ हो सकता है?
No, absolutely. See, this is something which I'm incredibly optimistic about. See, I think at the end of the day, right, why do people go into public service? Okay, particularly a lot of the top IAS officers, right? They are people who could make much more money, like in the private sector. So the best ones of them are there with the motivation for public service, right? But the problem is that you are so overwhelmed with the day-to-day firefighting. Just keeping this kind of enterprise that's the government running is kind of an all-consuming job. Right? And so there is not enough time. We talked in the first episode about transfers, short tenure. Right? There's just not enough time to kind of do the system-level thinking, right? So in general, I have found that the reception to the book among kind of policymakers has been very, very positive, right? And so, in fact, just yesterday, I'm in Bangalore this week, and so I gave a talk at the IAS Officers Association that was chaired by the former Chief Secretary, and he requested some 6 or 8 senior government officials to read different chapters and comment on it. And I think,
पढ़ के आए थे पूरा?
पूरा नहीं पढ़े. He was also very smart about it. He got them to read specific chapters and comment on specific chapters. But I think the overarching sense, and this is what, he said. He said, thank you. This is a national service that, that you've done here because we are all looking for solutions. And so now, obviously, this is not like something that you can then implement verbatim, but it's a set of principles and frameworks that then what my request to each of the officers was to say, you understand the reality of government. So now you apply your mind to which of these ideas is at the intersection of important and doable so that we can then prioritize those. And then, I will be available. And then, like I mentioned, there is a non-profit I've built called CGIS, which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States. And the whole point is that there are, we can't do anything without leadership from the government. But when the government has kind of interest, then my team is able to then support them, right? With kind of the next level of analysis, next level of research. This is how you might want to do it. So on that, I'm very, very optimistic.
Amazing. So you feel confident if, let's say, you do rigorous on-ground work, uncover some unique insight and have a recommendation for these are the parameters in which you can think about. The people on the other side will give it a fair hearing and think seriously about what to do. And
yeah, absolutely. And I think, and one other very, very important, another advantage of focusing on the state level, is that it gives you many, many, many more chances to experiment.
तो आप ऐसा करते हो कि उस स्टेट ने कर लिया आपको भी करना चाहिए वाला.
Exactly. It's not just that, right? I mean, so there's a deeper point, right? Which is, say, we need changes, okay? But even when we need changes, people are very risk averse. Okay? Like, अगर change ये हो गया तो क्या होगा, right? Like, I mean, so what you need is, मतलब जो reforms की, जो लोग reform करना चाहते हैं, आप मतलब you need to create systems that reduce the risk of experimentation and increase the likelihood of replication. So when you focus on government of India, then it is either yes or no for the entire country.
Yeah.
But when you focus at the state level, then you get 28 different cracks at it. And you've got different departments, different secretaries. So there's a menu of ideas here. So and based on the conditions in different states, based on kind of what individual officers get excited about, based on what individual political leaders get excited about, there is a menu. So even in the course of sieges, like, and in general, we like to be pretty, low profile just because it's the government that drives the work. We're there to support it. But even the last 3 to 4 years or 5 years of siege's existence, we've done different things in different states. And now you see that, every state is looking to learn. And they are excited. And they'll say, अच्छा, यहाँ पे आपने करके दिखाया है, तो please दिखाइए. We will be willing to consider. So I think there is a very positive, organic process, right? And the main challenge in government is not that people don't want to do good stuff. It is an overwhelmed state. I mean, it is, again, we've talked about the understaffing. We've talked about the range of the expectations relative to kind of the resources that are there. So you're just constantly firefighting to make sure that things are not going wrong or that certain projects are being implemented. So I think there is genuine kind of interest and appetite in engaging in these conversations.
So that's great to hear. And I mean, for you also, Karthik, I mean, your research work and teaching is in US, on the West Coast, but, committing yourself to the cause of development in India, and I know you do very thorough research. You spend a lot of time on ground, and kind of your research bubbles up for on ground fact as opposed to coming from ivory tower, building these air castles and complicated mathematical equations, right? And which is amazing. And I mean, I echo the sentiment of the IAS officers that this book is a national service, and I think it's hopefully going to spark a debate. And people in democracy, people should debate. There is no idea which is, this is my way or highway, but this is a quality input that people can then consider from various angles and think about it. So I'm going to start with the second half of the book, and that initially you make the distinction between economic development versus human development. So let's talk about that idea. What is the best way to process that? Why are those two things different?
Okay, so great, right? And so one of the great debates in global development for the past 40, 50 years is that historically, people thought that economic development is synonymous with economic growth, that you get richer and that's what development is about. And now what happened was that one of the key insights then of Amartya Sen and then later Gendres and others was to say that the point of development is not GDP per capita. Right? The point of development is to enhance human capabilities, human potential, right? So by moving from kind of a GDP framework to a human-centered framework, it was a very, very, very influential kind of way of thinking. Okay. Now, in practice, what does this mean? Right? So basically, if you look at the correlation between income and all of these human development outcomes, in almost every area, richer countries do better. Okay. So high-income countries have better health, better education, better public safety. Everything works better. Okay. So broadly, what happens? The growth wallas, will say, boss, in the long term, growth is the most important thing. Okay? If you look at India versus China, here is comparable in 1980, then 30, 40 years of 2% higher growth per year. And the power of compound interest is that it is transformative. Okay. So that we just need to focus on growth and everything else will follow. Okay. Now, what the development wallas will say, but dekho, if you look at that same graph, there are these big positive outliers. Okay? There are states like Kerala, there are countries like Vietnam, okay, that have very high human development, even without being very rich. Okay, so the argument there is to say, yes, eventually we might get rich and get developed.
Well, how is human development defined?
So human development, I think Sen's original idea was to kind of put more weight on health and education. And the formalization of this happened in the UN's Human Development Index. So the one simple way of saying this is that the World Bank and IMF historically were more growth wallas and they focused on GDP per capita. Then the UN, he took on some of the Sen frameworks and he created the Human Development Index, which has 1/3 weight on education, 1/3 weight on health, 1/3 weight on GDP per capita. Okay. Now, the truth is, at one level, this is this big debate, okay? But in practice, if you look at the data, these two measures are highly correlated because being rich helps spend in health and education. And so at one level, this debate, in my view, has been a bit of a distraction, okay? So, and that's kind of a key point in my book. Why? Because at one level, they're both right, okay? Clearly, more growth helps more human development. More human development helps more growth. So then what is the argument about? So the argument in the end ends up becoming more ideological, okay, which is the center right usually focuses more on growth, infrastructure, capex, and the center left says we want to do more social sector spending, okay. And so in the end, this debate in practice becomes ideological, and this is also mirrored in our politics, okay. So if you look at India over the last 20, 25 years, in general, the NDA governments, which have been center right, have focused more on capex, and they don't increase social spending much, but they try to improve efficiency, okay, which is a more center-right way of thinking about it. And the UPA governments have historically come and said, we are going to expand social spending, okay. So that it kind of lines up with the politics. And it's a perfectly healthy kind of range of debates in a democracy, right? Because I consider both kind of what has happened under these governments to be within the range of what you would expect in a healthy, well-functioning democracy, okay? So it's not like NDA government came and said, we're going to scrap Narega, okay? It's not like UPA government came and said, we are going to stop road construction. But the additional budget that comes every year, they put emphasis in different areas, okay? And that reflects that, okay? So the growth versus development debate broadly kind of follows, in India, the growth side would be famously, Jagdish Bhagwati, Arvind Panagriya, right? And the development side would be famously Amartya Sen, Jean Drèze, okay? Now, my point of departure in this chapter and in this book is to say, 50 years ho gaya, bahut ho gaya, okay? And it is time to recognize that this debate is really a distraction from the bigger problem, which is, it doesn't matter what you spend on it. The quality of spending is so bad. Okay. So this debate is still a debate on the top line of budget allocation. Okay. Of where am I allocating my money, but not on the bottom line of impact. Right. And so part of what we're showing in the book, for examples, is that in infrastructure, again, there's massive, just because you're doing capex doesn't mean it's kind of high quality of expenditure, because we have massive time overruns, cost overruns, massive inefficiency. And we have that in social sector too. So if you focus on the effectiveness of spending, I'm arguing you can do more of everything. Okay. So hence, again, the point of accelerating India's development, right? Okay, we are doing well, but how do you what is the factors in your control? Okay. See, there are many factors that will determine our future that are outside our control. Okay. Global war kya hoga, pandemic kya hoga, climate change kya hoga, we are too small to influence. We can have a growth, but we can't fundamentally shape it. But how we improve the functioning of our government is completely in our control. And so that's kind of where the focus is.
Clear. And early in the book, you use this framework called, Preston curve for measuring development. So can you explain, what exactly is Preston curve, why it matters?
Correct. And, that whole chapter, which serves as a bridge between the first half of the book, which is building an effective state, and the second half is accelerating development, right? So the whole point is we need to build an effective state to accelerate development. So this bridge chapter, right, called Shifting the Preston Curve, is a conceptually critical chapter. And what this is, if you see this graph, this is a graph that is a testament to one of the great triumphs of the 20th century in development. And it is showing on the x-axis, you have GDP per capita. On the y-axis, you have life expectancy. And what it is showing is that over time, this graph is shifting upwards. So in 1930, there was a certain level of life expectancy. In 1960, even at the same level of GDP per capita, you achieved much higher life expectancy. And then that keeps shifting up. And the most recent estimates in 2015 show it keeps shifting up. Okay. Now, what made this possible? What made this possible was newer technology and newer discoveries. Okay. And in medicine, we've had some of the most amazing innovations. Just think about the COVID vaccine, right? Yeah. So Spanish flu 100 years ago, had devastatingly larger impacts. And here we managed to find a vaccine within 12 to 14 months, which is a miracle.
Yeah. Absolute miracle. Distributing to billions of people.
And distributed to billions, right? So a very powerful kind of individual anecdote, which I talk about in the book, is in 1924, 100 years ago, the president of the United States, could not save his son from a simple bacterial infection in his toe that he got from playing tennis. Okay. And today, because we didn't have germ theory of disease, we didn't have antibiotics. So today, all of that is very, very, really routine. Okay. So the reason I point to this is saying that, so this idea of Preston curve comes from this paper by Samuel Preston, 1975. And then it's Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in 2015, who then highlighted that most of this improvement was not about more income, but it was about taking the knowledge and investing in the public systems needed to kind of deliver that.
Just for my understanding, so original Preston curve was mapping off as the per capita GDP increases, life expectancy also increases.
Correct.
And later on figure out the Preston curve itself is shifting because of
Exactly. Right. So the Preston curve is just a simple plot, but it's the shifting of the Preston curve that was kind of makes this point that you can do much better. And so why is that then the key to accelerating India's development? Okay. So now when we think about the scale of our problems, okay, whether it's education or health or other areas, it is what do we have today that we did not have 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Okay. And what I'm arguing is that the huge advance we have is in much better data, much better evidence, and that we can use to guide policy to grow dramatically more effectively. Okay. That a key part when I talked about effectiveness of public expenditure. See, in the last 20, 25 years, right, between the randomized control trials, between the much better measurement of outcomes, between kind of increase in computing power, it has dramatically improved the empirical research, body of empirical research. Right? So part of the logic of writing this book is to say, we know so much that we're not acting on. And so now is the time to synthesize this and kind of saying, listen, we can do so much better. So, and the core idea of the book, again, is quality of expenditure, which is driven by research and evidence and data, which we have, and technology that then allows us to take good ideas and kind of implement them at scale. So I'll give you one very simple example, right? So here is this graph, right, which we've talked about. But if you look at this graph, it's a graph on education, right? And I consider this to be perhaps the most important picture to understand education in India and most developing countries. And what it is showing is the x-axis here. This is coming from a sample of about 6,000 students in 40 schools across 4 districts in Rajasthan. And the x-axis here is showing the grade in which the student is enrolled in. The y-axis is the grade level of the learning levels. Okay? And now if the children are making progress as per the curriculum, they would be on this 45-degree line, blue line. But in practice, the true learning level is about half of that. Okay. So by the time you come to 8th standard, the average 8th standard student in a government school in Rajasthan has only about a 4th standard level of understanding maths. Okay. Now, but the deeper insight here is not just that. The deeper insight is now with dynamic computer-aided testing, you can kind of pinpoint the exact learning level of a child, right? So if you get a 7th standard question wrong, I can take down to 6th, down to 5th, down to 3rd, and calibrate exactly where you are. So in this picture, now each dot represents about 10 kids, okay? And what you see is that in that 8th standard class, there are children at a 2nd level, 3rd, 4th, all the way up to 8th standard. Now, why has this happened? This is one of the kind of unintended consequences of a well-intentioned no detention policy. Okay, so we said we want to prevent dropouts and make sure everybody stays in school till 14. So now you kind of automatically promoting children all the way up to 8th standard, even though the true learning level is at 2nd standard. Now, why is this so important? Because this then helps us make sense of why is our increasing in budget? Why are budgets not translating into impact? Okay, and that's because where does the budget go? The budget will go to building better facilities. It might go to hiring more teachers, getting more trained teachers. Okay. Now, we've talked in the past about problems of governance, teacher absence, etc. But now think about a very, very sincere teacher. Okay, you've got a sincere 8th standard teacher, fully committed. But what does a good teacher do? The good teacher thinks of his or her job as saying, मेरे को पोर्शन खत्म करना है, right? लेकिन मैं तो आपने टेक्स्ट बुक से सिंसियरली लेसन प्लान बनाया, आप क्लास में आके आप पढ़ाते हो, बट आप पोर्शन पढ़ा रहे हो और ये 8th स्टैंडर्ड की पोर्शन इधर है, बट आपके 70-80% बच्चे जो हैं आर सो फार बिहाइंड, राइट? लाइक आई मीन कि अगर आप सिंसियरली पढ़ा रहे हो तो उनको कुछ समझ में नहीं आ रहा है. तो இப்போ வந்து இதுக்கு நடுவில் நான் வந்து இப்போ தமிழில் பேச ஆரம்பித்தா ஒரு வேறு பாஷையில் பேச ஆரம்பித்தா நான் வந்து எவ்வளோ குவாலிஃபைடாக இருந்தாலும் சரி, எவ்வளோ மோட்டிவேட்டட் இருந்தாலும் சரி, எவ்வளோ சின்சியராக கற்றுக் கொடுத்தாலும் சரி, உங்களுக்கு ஒரு வார்த்தை புரியாது. ஸோ நான் வந்து இந்த மாதிரி ஏன் பேசிகிட்டு இருக்கேன், ஏன்னா உங்களுக்கு வந்து ஒரு நிமிஷம் கொஞ்சம் ஃபீலிங் ஆகட்டும் வந்து நம்மளுக்கு வந்து தினம் நம்ம நாட்டில் வந்து குழந்தைகளுக்கு ஸ்கூலில் எது மாதிரி ஃபீலிங் ஆகுதுன்னு கொஞ்சம் உங்களுக்கும் புரியட்டும்.
I followed every word that Karthik.
But so what did I just do to you, right? I just given you 45 seconds in the shoes of a typical kid in a typical classroom in India. And that's because you kind of push kids through school as part of kind of no detention without paying attention to learn. Okay. And the reason our spending is not translating into outcomes.
No, that's very powerful. You know, basically what you're saying is, you know, let's say I'm a kid in 8th standard and my teacher is teaching something which is as per the 8th standard textbook, but my learning level is a 4th grade level. It's basically Tamil or Greek to me, right? I have no idea what is being said in the classroom and therefore no incentive to even engage and, you know,
Exactly.
further progress.
Exactly. Right? And so, and anybody who's been in the classroom kind of knows, okay, first row wale bache like process kar rahe hain, like, I mean, and then you're progressively losing the kids, like, I mean, as they go behind. And so schooling often just becomes a bit of a daycare center, right? Like, I mean, and a way to kind of just keep kids occupied and maybe there's some social stuff. So listen, this is not to say this structure, okay, probably exists in many education systems around the world, okay? In fact, in the US, I'm sure there are schools that have similar kind of challenges. Okay? But the point I'm making is that if our goal as a country, right, coming back to what we said in the very first episode, is to say that we are at this place where we've got 50% of children who complete primary school without even being able to read. So, and if you can't get to that basic level, you're permanently compromising the future of these children. Because even, forget going to university, even if you just want to get skills and stay current in whatever you have to do, there's this saying in education, right? You have to learn to read to be able to read to learn. And so if you're not delivering even that basic, then you can pump in lakhs of crores and it's not going to translate in outcome. So the key point here is paisa itna spend kar raha hai, impact kyun nahi ho raha hai? And that is because what the research and the data allows you to see is get that insight inside the classroom.
And Karthik, is this a classic example of this efficiency thing we talked about? Because earlier in our budget discussion, we saw, I think, roughly 10% of entire budget is spent on education, which is massive amount of money. And I think one of the things you mentioned in the book, we have this kind of polar opposite spectrum. On one hand, we have IITs and IIMs, and we produce some of the brightest students in the world, which are now running so many Silicon Valley companies and so on, and so many doing great in academia like yourself, many others, pretty much all US universities. On the other hand, we have large majority of kids who are not even able to get decent primary education. So through all of your research, what are some of your key insights? Why is this state of affairs?
Yeah. No, and I think, and you're picking up exactly, the right question, because when I present this in the US, people will ask, hey, we thought you had an outstanding education system, right? CEO of Microsoft, CEO of Google, CEO of IBM, like, you guys are running the world, okay? Yeah. And this is why I think about India, right?
Very soon US president also.
Exactly, right? So there's this famous saying that in India, that everything that is true about India, the opposite is also true, okay? And some of that just reflects the sheer size of the population, okay? But I think more kind of, practically fact-based, right, is that the successes we are seeing are a incredibly small slice of the population, right? So what we have set up through our IITs and kind of, high stakes exams is we have set up systems to identify who is smart, okay? Whether we teach them or not, okay? So it is a selection system. It is a filtration system. It is not an education system. Okay? So the basic story of the Indian education system is you have set up a structure that helps you identify who is smart, not necessarily to teach somebody who is not naturally.
Before all the rigorous entrance exam system.
Exactly, right? So, and the basic way to explain the success is that if you take the top 0.1% of a billion-person distribution, they will do amazing things. Now, of course, it also reflects in many ways kind of some of the greatness of American society, which is open to talent, right? Because why does that same talent succeed the most in the US rather than anywhere else?
It's both greatness and opportunistic, man. You basically invite the best and brightest from the world and come,
and come, and that renews the greatness, right? Like, I mean, so it reflects kind of the unique nature of the US as kind of being built of a body of kind of immigrants, and immigrants in general tend to have more initiative because you're willing to take the risk to kind of rebuild your life, right? So some combination of the structural factors of the US economy and some combination of the fact that the selection is kind of a right-tail selection is kind of what reflects that. But I think the honest truth is one of India's, I would say, great mistakes in the early years, unlike East Asia, is that East Asia prioritized primary education. We put a lot more focus on high tertiary education. Now, there was a well-intentioned reason. The well-intentioned reason was the founders, including Pandit Nehru, believed that we need technical manpower to be able to adopt technologies. Okay, so if you want to build, if I want to build bridges, 30 primary school graduates cannot substitute for one civil engineer. Okay, so there is a sense in which kind of technical manpower really matters for national development. Okay, that was what it reflected. But what we missed is the fact that for your kind of entire low-skill manufacturing or kind of getting large numbers of people out from poverty into kind of even a lower middle class, that the basic level of skills was absolutely essential. And so you can see even today, the downstream impact of the structure of our education system is seen all the way in our economy, right? So why do we still So we do incredibly well in skill-intensive services and even skill-intensive manufacturing because we have concentrated on the right tail. Okay, where we do poorly is in low skills-intensive mass manufacturing that will create tons of jobs. Correct. So compared to China, compared to Vietnam, that's where we kind of, that's where we fail. And it's a good chance to actually take a step back and think about the Indian economy overall, right? So just traditionally, manufacturing has been really important for accelerating kind of development for 3 reasons. Okay, one is you get the economies of scale from division of labor and kind of, the specialization that comes on an assembly line, right? So that's division of labor. And then because manufacturers were exportable, you got exports. And the third key part is that manufacturing created a large number of reasonably well-paying jobs for low-skill workers. Okay, but that has a double benefit, right? It helps get people off agriculture, but it also creates a demand multiplier because of the incomes of kind of the boosting the incomes of the poor is always better from a demand perspective. Right? Now, what India did, we were lucky that kind of the internet happened in the 1990s. And so what that did was it made non-tradable services into tradable services. Okay. So traditionally manufacturing, you could load it on a ship and send it. You couldn't kind of do like tuitions or like, need software support. And the internet is what allowed us to leapfrog. Yeah. Okay, so we leapfrog manufacturing and kind of have done incredibly well. And this is why the India story is still, overall a good story. But it's not at full potential because we're firing on 2 of those 3 legs. But this third piece of low skill, large kind of labor intensive manufacturing has not happened. Now, there's many reasons for that, including, labor laws and a bunch of other small-scale industry reservations and all of that. But one key point is it also reflects the long-term implication of the structure of our education system, right? So that's how education plays this long-term role in how economies evolve.
So in education, I think you mentioned this report as well somewhere. I think the Pratham does this report. What is it called?
Sir, Annual Status of Education Report.
Right. So the report hasn't been very optimistic, from whatever I've seen of it. It's pretty much a similar stats year after year. So on one hand, we are spending pretty reasonable amount of money, and yet it doesn't look like, at a grassroots levels it's getting any better. Now, last 5-6 days, also so much talk about, give every child a laptop, give them a tablet, free education, let AI teach them and whatnot. But हो नहीं रहा है कुछ. क्या core reason क्या है और वो कब change होगा?
See, I think part of the problem is that it's a really difficult problem. And everybody is looking for silver bullet solutions, right? And there is no silver bullet. Okay, there is no silver bullet. Okay, it requires kind of a broad-based national kind of consensus across citizen, state, society, and then a continuous kind of action. Okay, now, but one myth let me bust. Okay, the common myth is that this is because we're not spending enough. Okay, so one key fact to remember is that China and Vietnam delivered better education with lower budgets than India.
Lower budget per student?
Lower budget per student in school education. Okay. And one of the key reasons...
Is that true still or was true?
Yeah, it was, at least, so even Amartya Sen and John Dress, who are pro-social sector, in the 2013 book, they document. And the biggest reason for this is actually that teacher unions in India have been so powerful. The teacher salaries in India are actually among the highest in the world. Okay, so most of that money, most of that budget, goes into large unconditional increases in pay. Okay? Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't respect teachers or shouldn't pay teachers well, right? But the problem is that there is this question of what is called appropriate technology, which is a very old idea. And this idea is very simple, which is what we try to do is we try to say we want the most qualified people and people pay well to get the most qualified teachers. Okay. But if you then look at who gets selected from these exams, they are disproportionately either from urban areas or they want to locate in urban areas because their income is now so high that they don't feel socially connected to the villages. Okay. So part of the reason for why you have the absence and accountability problem is that you think you're doing the right thing by selecting the most qualified teachers, but they are not connected to their communities. Okay. In contrast, right? If you take a different model for the human resource problem and saying, let us take local talent from the village that is committed to that area and invest in upskilling them through a set of, practicum-based kind of training programs, which I talk about, then you can kind of deliver much better impact for the same budget. Okay? And the same thing in health, right? So one of the most effective interventions in health in the last 30, 40 years has been the Asha worker model, right? And Asha workers are not very fancy, super educated doctors. They are kind of typically hired kind of with a 12th pass from the local village, but provided enough training to then be able to perform certain basic functions. And so that's then the point, right? Which is, so again, in China and Vietnam, like they had teachers, but the teachers were often local. Then it comes back to the federalism point that they were accountable to the local government. And so which meant that even if, because teaching first class, second class doesn't require a super fancy degree. It requires kind of, presence and just constantly working in smaller groups. So there are just, the point is that we have tried to scale up kind of a very, very cost ineffective model. Okay. And then we say we are not delivering because we haven't spent enough. But you need to really apply your mind to kind of creating more cost effective models. And then there are whole margins. Of course, there is path dependence. Okay. So you can't completely change how we built our education system.
So if you just, because, we have the benefit of 28 states, which means 28 different, outcomes. And if you compare some of the top 3 states with the bottom 3, what is different from education point of view? Yeah. I'm sure some states are doing, hopefully, really good job because, literacy rates in some states are close to 100% now.
Correct.
So what are the fundamental differences?
No, it's a very good question. See, I think, to be completely honest, I think the southern states, historically have done better. But some of this, I don't think is just about government, but it's also about society. Okay? And so it is not an accident that states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Maharashtra, that kind of generally do better, have also had broad-based social reform movements.
Yeah.
Okay? So, and this is where I think maybe the legacy of caste does have something to do with our challenges in education, right? Because, and it has actually at least 2 or 3 ways in which kind of the structure of our kind of caste system has hurt us in education. See, the first is that every society has inequality. Okay? But what the caste system, as Dr. Ambedkar famously said, is it is a graded hierarchy. Okay? And so what that does is it makes it difficult to create solidarity to kind of demand better public goods. Right? So there's a lot of evidence that says that kind of social solidarity matters for kind of demanding effective public goods. Okay? Because the more stratified your society is, the more what you're demanding from the politicians is benefits for your group.
Yeah.
Okay? Whereas the more homogeneous or harmonized society is, the more you demand public goods. Okay? And so, see, the politics itself is downstream of society. Okay? And so one thing you could argue is maybe China and Vietnam benefited from not having that kind of stratification. And they were both communist society, they had gone through communist revolutions. The communist revolution has an element of egalitarianism that's built into those societies. Okay. So it's not just about the money, it's also about the society, right? So the one way in which caste hurts is that. But there's another way in which caste hurts, okay, which is very indirect, which is one of the reasons we are over-centralized is because the founders of kind of India, including Dr. Ambedkar, did not trust local elites to deliver public services to the marginalized. Okay, so in a world where kind of the sense is that denying education was something that was key to maintaining local kind of power structures. If you're a progressive policymaker at the center, then you say, I need to I don't trust the local government.
You want to bypass them.
And so you centralize, right? So one of the reasons, so if you look at some of the discussions in the Constitution, and I think Madhav Khosla has a recent kind of discussion on kind of, trade-offs and choices made in the Constitution. And one of there are 3 reasons we're over-centralized. Okay? So when we say we're the most over-centralized country in the world, it is not because, of malice. Okay. There were very good historical reasons, right? So the first reason was political. That at the time of independence, the biggest fear of the founders was the country is going to break apart. Okay? So which is why we have such a strong center. We have an Article 356. It's unheard of in the US for the president to be able to dismiss a state government. Unheard of. Asambhav. Ho nahi sakta, okay? But yahan pe some 80 times, 100 times, fully democratically elected state governments have just been summarily dismissed.
Then I think I was seeing the stat in your book, I think especially between 60 to 90.
Exactly.
Some 80 instances of center just summarily dismissing state government. I mean, that.
Right? So, but that reflects the kind of how much we over-centralize powers. Okay? And then till the Bombay judgment, then that kind of put a bit of a stop to that, right? So that was one reason. The second reason for over-centralizing was economic, right? Because there was this sense that central planning is needed. And so you need to coordinate the resources. And that, because at that time, see, we were also very poor. Okay. So state governments didn't even have much money, right? So there was a sense that only government of India can mobilize the resources needed to make the investments. And so there was economic. And then there was a social reason. So the social reason for centralizing was people like Dr. Ambedkar did not trust local elites. And so he famously said, what is a village but kind of, a den of ignorance and vice and prejudice and, and so that was the opinion. And so And it's amazing, right? How you can see this in popular culture, right? The tension between kind of traditional society and a modernized state. So again, panchayat. So, you've got this thing of the elected sarpanch is a woman. Like in practice, it is this sarpanch pati. Okay. So you see that the traditional society will kind of veer towards patriarchy and not kind of, let the women lead. Here is a modernizing state. And so if you see, remember episode 8 in season 1, like, it is only when the collector comes, okay, like, because the collector represents the modernizing state. And you see the pressure that puts on kind of traditional society to say, okay, like, she will at least learn to sing the anthem and hoist the flag. Okay. So, and what the research shows on all of this is that despite kind of the pushback from society, a lot of these affirmative actions have helped, right? So you then see this underlying tension between kind of a modernizing state and a traditional society play out in a lot of these areas. Okay. So, but to then come back and kind of link this back to decentralization, right? Is that one of the points I make is that, again, and this is, I think, a recurring theme, okay, in many topics, is that there are choices that we made that made sense when we made this. Okay? Whether it's our agricultural policies in the 1960s or whether it's our over-centralization of the constitutional movement. But we are now in such a completely different world, both with regard to the economy, with education, with information, that it is time to kind of really reimagine, like, what do these institutions look like, okay, to get to full potential. And so then closing the loop on education, when you come back and saying, why are we not able to deliver? Why is it still the same? Like, over 20, 30 years. And to me, I think the simple answer is the ultimate stakeholder is the parent. Okay. And we've not empowered the parents. And so you can form a parent-teacher council, you can form something, but they have zero authority on the teachers. They have zero authority. So in fact, yesterday again at the session, the former chief secretary was saying that one of the things they did in Karnataka was at least allow the chairman of the parent committee to sign the casual leave of the teacher. Okay, so kuch to authority tha, and that made a difference. Okay, so long term, I think solving the education problem is going to be a combination of using the research to guide kind of the effective interventions, but also reforming governance. Like, to again decentralize authority.
Correct. So since you have, I think for the education chapter is one of the longer chapters and a lot of comprehensive data. What's the takeaway, from, say, if you look at that, I know personally a lot of people who are quite committed to, trying to do something about education. Obviously, Pratham is outstanding. I think CSF does a bunch of work, right, that you work, with. I think one ex-colleague of mine, Mekin, he is building this organization from Flipkart, he's like committed last 7-8 years. But when you zoom out, it doesn't look like things are moving that much. So is it like, almost like a crisis of education grassroots levels, or you are seeing enough green shoots to be optimistic?
And again, so I think, Manish Sabarwal, had this beautiful quote, and which I cite in chapter 9, where he says, the government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and civil society has a scale deficit. Okay, so the challenge is that the government has scale and legitimacy, but is not able to execute. The private sector can execute at scale, but is driven by the profit motive and therefore is not trusted in the social sector. Civil society, there are a lot of outstanding kind of organizations, but they fundamentally can't scale because you don't have a revenue model of either fees or taxes. Okay, so private sector has to get revenue from paying customers, and the government has taxes. Okay, so the challenge, therefore, when you want to solve such a wicked problem at scale, okay, is how do you leverage kind of the creative energy of civil society, like that is kind of thinking out of the box, trying to create kind of exemplary solutions, and then partner them, with some people. And so sometimes, of course, there is, even in civil society, there is kind of an older style, right? Which was more about building schools, hospitals. And now I think there is a newer, younger generation of philanthropy that is bringing, and civil society orgs that are bringing more management principles and trying to bring some efficiency. But in the end, you cannot solve the scale problem unless you really work with government, right? Because particularly, most of these problems are in the bottom 50% and of the socioeconomic distribution. And that's a distribution that primarily relies on the government. So, which is why, again, part of the point of a book like this is to say that elites and middle classes who have done so well, we cannot ignore the state if we want to kind of, build a better India.
Karthik, you remember, I think this is FDR, I think in 40s he said, give me one-handed economist. Have you come across that, right?
Yeah, Truman.
Truman said, right? Because, economists, always have, nuanced view about, on one end, आप ये कर सकते हैं, on the other end, यार मैं वैसे decision. So education may give me something optimistic. Give me a reason to feel optimistic about this interview.
Yeah. वो आपका क्या कौन सा लाइन है? I think 3 dates में लाइन है ना. कहना क्या चाहते हो भाई? लेकिन कुछ करो क्या? Okay. So, but which is then exactly what I try to do, right? With just a bunch of concrete, actionable ideas. Okay. So, I think the foundational part, right, which again government is doing, okay, but can do better, right? Is this kind of universal foundational literacy numeracy. Okay, that is the foundation. Now, to be fair, it's there in all the policy documents. 12th plan mein tha, NEP mein hai. Abhi NEP ke baad, we are doing Nipun, which is kind of, and it has gotten political salience and people are trying to do this. Now, and there's a lot of good things happening again. Now, the challenge where kind of the rubber is hitting the road is that despite all of the design, despite all of that, it takes time in the scale of the system for that to permeate all the way down. And which is why, for me, one of the foundational investments we can do to accelerate this thing is independent measurement of outcomes. Because till you don't have the outcomes, the entire government machinery is operating on schemes. Okay? Because in any organization, what you measure is what you get. So today, when the principal secretary takes a review meeting with the district collectors, what is being reviewed? What is being reviewed is essentially inputs. Right? I mean, books पहुंचे क्या टाइम पे, okay, like computers पहुंचे, ये स्कीम पहुंचा क्या नहीं, okay, अगर निपुण की बात हो रही है तो वहां पे वर्कशीट्स पहुंचे क्या नहीं, ठीक है. So effectively the government functions as a department of education logistics. It doesn't function as a department of education. Okay? And even with the RTE, like one of the people who was influential afterwards, he confessed to me, he said, listen, RTE is a Right to Education Facilities Act. It is not a right to education. Okay. So the point is there is a lot of scaffolding that goes into kind of making what seems like an effective school. Right. But the government does not have visibility on teaching, learning, and doesn't have visibility on outcomes. Okay. So if you look at, for example, a slight tangent, but we did this large study in Madhya Pradesh, okay, on school governance, where the government had this incredibly detailed school governance kind of program, and they put so much effort, political backing, senior officials, and idea was to do school assessment, anyway, long story short, when we go to the research, what we find is that the program looked beautiful on paper, but there was zero impact. Now, I know you said optimistic, but I'm giving you first a piece of depressing result to then tell you what we need, okay? So the point of the depressing result is that the system, it's not like nothing happened, okay? The school assessments were done. School improvement plans were done. And because these things were uploaded and these things were monitored. But nothing changed inside the classroom. And that's because there's no visibility on what's going on inside there, right? So even in the government, there is management, there is कुछ ना कुछ तो review होता है, but you can only review based on the data you have. Okay, so which goes back then to chapter 4 and the foundational part of kind of data. Right? So what we've done now in Telangana for the first time. So now we said be optimistic. Right? So Telangana government for the first time in India, you've got a state government now that has commissioned an independent survey, okay, that does 50,000 households. See, the problem with Pratham is that however great the Pratham data is, the government would never accept it because it was from outside the government, okay? So they have to act on their official data. And like we showed, the official data is all fake, okay? It's all inflated, right? So we wasted 20 years as a country because in the official data, there's no learning crisis. The learning crisis is only there in the independent data, okay? So
20 years is like lost one generation.
Right? So these are staggering consequences. Okay, so which is why to me, one of the most foundational things is to say you need the annual data on the outcomes because that is what gets you a sense of, am I on the right track? Nahi to 20 saal phir you will spend on schemes. Okay, so and this is very important to understand about bureaucracy because bureaucracy works on schemes, logistics. Okay, so even in 2009, there was this attempt to do accountability in the government through what's called a results framework document. Cabinet Secretariat had set this up. Performance management unit. So what were the goals in education? The goals in education are access, equity, and quality. Okay. Now, what did the ministry, then MHRD do? They said, okay, idea badhiya. But access was defined as school construction. How many schools have I built? Okay. Equity was defined as how many schemes do I have for girls and underprivileged groups? Okay. And quality was defined as how many training programs for my teachers. So everything that is a noble goal has been converted into a scheme. And what will happen? The scheme boxes will be ticked, but the outcomes will still not. So it's a wicked problem. Okay, so but you start by kind of saying that you have to constantly measure the outcomes. And so what is unique about Telangana KPI survey is the data is from within the government, but outside the department. So it is sitting in the planning department, which is kind of, therefore the data is official. So we just started. Okay?
But would you call, I'm going to put you on the spot, but the primary and secondary education were bottom 50 in the country. would you call it a crisis situation?
Absolutely. There's no question. See, Anil Swarup is the former Secretary School Education. Like, I mean, as basically, I cite him at the end of the chapter. Okay, he's run the whole system for 2 years. He says, other than kind of get all children into school, we have been a colossal failure. We have failed. We have failed our children. There is no question about
it. That's quite sobering.
It is. It is. Right? And I think it's again partly because of elite exit, right? So elites have completely exited, right, from being recipients of public services.
Yeah.
And you see some of that happening even in tertiary education, right? There is now there's concern that there is kind of weakening of Indian universities because Indian elites are now think about the mushrooming of international schools and international boards, and the elites are now kind of going abroad for college. So even that is being lost. Okay, so one part of the story is kind of elite exit, and just apathy. Okay, frankly, right. And the other part is that governance, it's a difficult problem. That even with all of the sincerity and all the commitment, solving this problem at scale is a really wicked problem. So then coming to concrete ideas. Okay. So let me give you one example of how, again, well-intentioned interventions have backfired. So one we talked about was the no detention policy, right? Okay, how you end up therefore with kids who are not dropping out but are second standard level. Now, the other one was this idea of saying we must have a school in every habitation, because the access goal was therefore defined as we must have a school within 1 kilometer of every habitation. So what has happened as a result is we have built an enormous number of subscale schools. So you've got literally lakhs, of schools, or at least tens of lakhs. All India, definitely lakhs, of schools with under 50 students. And in every habitation, so you have one school, and many of them have under 20 kids, 20 kids, 30 kids, right? So you have 20 kids, 5 standards, and 2 teachers. So the reason we have done this is to say you should be in 1 kilometer distance from school. But that has been bad for governance, bad for pedagogy, bad for social integration, and bad for cost effectiveness. Okay, so it's bad for governance because these schools are so small and far, you can't monitor them, you can't have a head teacher. It's bad for pedagogy because I have 2 teachers teaching 5 classes. So then you're doing multi-grade teaching. Simultaneously, class mein 3 kakshe ke bachche saath mein baithe, to kaise padhoge aap? So that's problem. It is also really bad for social integration. That one of the purposes of public schooling is to create a space where children of different socioeconomic groups can come and kind of identify and empathize with the diversity of society. But because habitations in rural India tend to be very caste and community segregated, you have actually segregated these schools that when you go to kind of a village, people will even say, Asti Basti ka school. That is how that school is known. Okay. So you have actually kind of further hurt kind of the social goal. And then finally, it's really bad for cost effectiveness because the teacher is the most expensive part of the cost. And then when you have 2 teachers for 30 kids, then that cost is way high.
Understood, Gandhi. So I think the picture that's, obviously education is very important, also very complicated. I think we have a bit of a checkered history, and it's a given that governments have to play a big role. It is one area where we can't say that somehow, just private sector will kind of step up and do it. It's just impossible. So let's park it there. I realize I think it's all to this conversation prompting many other questions.
And I'll just say one final thing on that. Right? What I do believe is I think it is possible today for a chief minister, who says that I want one of my signature achievements in my 5-year term to be that we will make a step function improvement in learning outcomes. We know what to do. Okay. Now, we know what to do. So it is not like it is something that we have to wait for 15 years to solve how to do it. We know what to do. We just have to do it. So which means a bunch of things are happening, but it needs the political salience, it needs that mind share, and it needs that commitment to the data and the monitoring to say, is 5 saal mein, mere time pe, ye hum karke dekh.
So in the next 5 saal mein, I think all states will go through their elections. So let's look out for which chief ministers are publicly willing to kind of bet their campaigns on.
But that is the problem. See, the problem, what in fact a senior IAS officer told me, he said, the only thing worse than not promising something is promising and not delivering. So the reason they're scared to promise is they don't know if they can get the system to deliver.
आपकी बुक पढ़ के समझ जाएंगे ना?
That is the hope.
और एटलीस्ट पढ़ के थोड़े पॉइंटर्स मिल जाएंगे. Not claiming कि इसी में सारे आंसर हैं, but good food for thought. I think there is enough literature available. A lot of people are very sincere minded. A lot of people who, even from private sector, and the education sector that most people get attracted because intuitively you understand that that is like really foundational. If you're fixing there, then a lot of downstream things will take care of itself. But let's switch gear. Let's talk about your next chapter right after education on health, right? And health is very peculiar in India. Is I think most people agree that health and education is something, government needs to play a big role. But India, up to I think 70% of healthcare is provided by private sector, and there's a huge, quality of, care difference. Most people don't afford. अगर वो जान बचानी है, तो किसी ना किसी तरह वो अपना घर वर बेच के भी प्राइवेट के पास जाते हैं. लोग गांव से लोग शहर में आते हैं इलाज कराने के लिए, all that, right? So which is also very unique and peculiar to India. And I don't know, is that the drift? Like, is it moving more and more towards, private sector is just servicing most of security?
Yeah. So health is one of the most complex topics of policy period. Okay? Like, I mean,
US के और भी खराब है, तो यहाँ पे
exactly, right? So health is one of the hardest policy areas anywhere in the world. Okay? And what makes health such a wicked problem is that many of your normal, first of all, governments get involved mainly for equity reasons. But even without that, health is a place where the market breaks down. Okay? And why does the market kind of not function as well? The first is that there is massive asymmetry of information between the patient and the doctor. Okay, so you don't know what is wrong with you. You don't know whether so A, you have no way of assessing the doctor's knowledge. B, you have no way of assessing that even if the doctor knows, is the procedure something that reflects financial incentives, like, to overtreat. Okay, so there is that asymmetry of information, which is why historically, the medical profession has tried to inculcate Hippocratic oath and ethics because the market accountability doesn't work. You have to rely on certain ethical behavior, like, to get the right. Okay. Now, second problem is market analogies. Markets work by saying, I'm going to comparison shop for efficiency and prices. Okay. But यहाँ पे आपकी accident हो गई, you're not going to be bargaining. Okay. Like, I mean, you say, boss, jaan bachao. So, and then the other problem is that there is enormous kind of other market failures. Okay? So these are just the basics. So, for example, the public health, right, is something that the market will underprovide because it is preventive. So you can't monetize it. Okay. So you can't. So, and then there are spillovers and externalities. And then there is income distribution. So it is one of the most complex policy topics anywhere in the world. Okay? And partly because of all of these structural challenges, and partly because of the equity kind of implications in health, right? See, as a society, most societies feel, chalo, if you're rich and living in a fancy house, driving a fancy car, we don't grudge it that much, okay? But we want there to be somewhat more of a level playing field when it comes to health and education, because these are enablers for people to live and participate.
Yeah.
Okay? So, long story short, it's a complex topic. Now, coming to India, right? The basic story of health in India is that the demand, there is always demand for healthcare, right? But the official kind of qualified providers, where combination of underinvestment in public systems and underinvestment in medical education, which is also suboptimally controlled, you're in a situation where the vast majority of healthcare providers are unqualified quacks. Now, the real kind of scary part is the government has no idea about them because they're not supposed to practice. Okay, so technically, like, they're illegal. So, government doesn't even have the data. So the only way you know they exist is from the household data. And we actually, my co-authors and I, we had done one of India's first nationwide studies in 2010 of literally mapping kind of the distribution of these unqualified providers of the whole landscape. And that's how we even have the data that about 70% of the private providers were unqualified. Now, this was 2010, so it may have changed a bit. But I think the fundamental story of healthcare in India is that you've got a weak public system, okay? And again, there's huge variation across states. And a lot of that void is filled by the private. The private is not great either. The private is only slightly better, okay? Slightly. So when I think about public versus private in both education and health, I think there are a few common patterns that emerge. And again, we've done some very, very careful studies, okay, which we can link. Head of kind of how do you, because the research aspect of this itself can be an entire episode. Okay? How do you measure healthcare quality? Okay. But so to give you one thing, what we did was we actually had a bunch of well-trained actors, who went and presented symptoms, okay, in a range of clinics. Okay? It was a 6-month process, okay, and in fact, that process had a health anthropologist on the team to then kind of really train them on how to present these symptoms. So that was done by medical doctors. I didn't do that. But I was doing kind of the economic modeling of the implications of that.
Understood. So these people will go to various doctors and present, basically fake the symptoms and record the outcome.
Exactly, right? So because the whole point of effective care is to say that when a patient walks with a symptom, okay, how do you kind of identify the pathway of diagnosis? Okay, so a lot of kind of, sorry, so there's a whole sub-research genre of measuring quality, okay, which is, there are whole literatures on that. But coming back to the key facts, okay, in education and health, I would say in private, there are 2 or 3 common patterns in education and health, okay, which is the public sector is much more qualified in both education and health, because the private schools will typically have unqualified teachers and the private sector has unqualified doctors. Okay? Now, I'm not talking about fancy corporate hospitals that you and I go to. This is the vast majority of healthcare. Okay. So they're less qualified, but they work harder. So they generally make up for lower effort, lower knowledge with higher effort.
And they also market incentives. Sir, अच्छा काम नहीं करेंगे तो फिर वो customer.
Exactly, right? So you don't get paid if you're absent, right? You have to show up, right? So the basic story, therefore, is that on paper, right, it might look like they are quacks and it might look like, this thing, but they also have to survive in the market, right? So which means that they have the incentives to work harder. How do these informal quacks, where are they getting their medical education from? So many of them have actually been compounders and ward boys, like, who've been kind of shadowing kind of other doctors. Now, the problem is the quality of the doctor they shadow was also variable. So there's enormous variation, right? It's a wild west.
Exactly. Are there a lot of practicing quote unquote doctors who are actually don't have MBBS degree, but they're kind
of course.
And वो बाहर क्या लिखा रहता है
doctor? आप गाँव में जाइए, like you just go, like so in rural Madhya Pradesh where we did this work, we estimated that, typically आप चौक में जाएंगे, like doctor लिखा होगा, like, and then आप जाके बात करेंगे, तो मतलब हाँ, so there's no formal MBBS, nobody has an MBBS, like, so at most they might have done like, some degree in some alternate medicine, ऐसा कुछ किया होगा, but generally नहीं, like,
but they're still able to provide decent service.
But this,
on the job learning,
so this is the interesting thing, okay? Which is, they're illegal, okay? So government will try to shut them down, okay? But you can't shut them down because there is demand. They have a respectability in the community. So aap shut down kiya, but people are saying, "Acha doctor, they'll go to their house to get the treatment," okay? So one of my more controversial ideas, okay, like I've seen in that chapter, which again is backed by research, right? Which is, see, what has happened in medicine is that because the existing highly qualified doctors are so conscious of protecting their turf, okay? They do not want any kind of so they say we can't dilute standards. Okay? But what I'm arguing is that, listen, if you actually do some modular training, okay, 3 months, 6 months courses, okay, you have all of this skilling. We're trying to do skilling, okay? So, but why not skill the people who are in the community, who are delivering the services, okay, and offer them a modest credential. Don't let them call themselves a doctor, okay? Like, but you credential themselves at the level of a kind of certified health provider, the level of, say, even a nurse, okay? And the whole point is to say, okay, you are in the community, you are present, you have trust, okay? So let us train you in how to deliver certain things better. And let us also train you of when to refer something, okay? When something is beyond your knowledge. And let us use technology, let us use telemedicine to start referring things. But use their presence in the community and leverage that because they're there. So, and every time you try to ban them, it doesn't work because they're there and they're serving, fulfilling a need, okay? So that is one of the points. But again, the problem is that we often treat these quacks as kind of malicious actors, malicious actors. Like, they are fulfilling a need in the community and they will not survive if they're not delivering some value. Now, there are tons of problems, okay? There's problems of over-medication. There is problems of, because see, basically, why does over-medication happen? And there's another subtle insight, right? So one view is over-medication happens because doctors have financial incentives to over-prescribe. Okay? Now, that might be true at some fancy corporate hospitals. But if you go to rural areas, right? The reason for over-medication is very different. It is that the most important thing the patient wants, he needs to feel better to go back to work the next day. Because if you don't, every day you can't work is a day you can't earn. And that's a day you can't feed your family, right? Which means the single most important thing he wants is symptomatic relief. So what does his doctor do? He says, I don't know what's wrong with you, but I'm 5 goli de raha hu, ek to kaam karega. So the reason for over-medication, and we model this, like, which proper statistical Bayesian models, like, of kind of posteriors and stuff. But the basic intuition is that, okay? So we kind of, jumped up a bit. But part of this reflects kind of a legacy of the fact that, again, going back to a different aspect of colonial legacy, okay, which connects back to the first episode. See, the district medical officer, that office was not created to provide population health. That office was created to provide care to the British officers, okay, like who were ruling that area, okay. So the most important thing, आपको collector की इलाज करनी है, SP की इलाज करनी है, right? So medical care is not a public good; it is a private good because I can exclude. Okay, so one of the key insights in that health chapter, right, which I'll say, is that again looking at models across states. So what is one positive example? Is if you look at Tamil Nadu again, see, Kerala and Himachal Pradesh are states that deliver good health, but they spend a lot. Tamil Nadu delivers comparable health, but spending much less. So how do they do that? Okay. So one of the key to Tamil Nadu is they have a public health card. And the key point is that the returns to preventive population health are much, much higher than the returns to curative private health. See, curative care is I'm giving you as a private person. So that aspect of curative care is not a public good, it's a private good. But preventive health is a public good. But a medical doctor is trained in curative health, is not trained in population health. Whereas the public health folks, like it's not even a big crew, it's about 200, 300 people, but they are then empowered to coordinate in terms of disease surveillance, kind of vector health, population health, and those things end up being like very, very, very costly.
On this, I want to say, I'm personally, Karthik, I'm a huge fan of preventive health, and it's like an absolute no-brainer. Like the cost is not even 1/10, right? But it requires a lot of evangelism, public awareness, and some proactive work. The tools are all now known. Kuch rocket science nahi hai.
Correct.
But uske liye, finding right, I don't know, the champions within the government to really put an agenda ki prevent. Jise thoda, include our prime minister, yoga day ko promote karte hain, which is great, but wo ek hi din hai. Preventive health ke liye wo pure 365 din kuch karna padta hai. So for that, I think it will be great somehow, if there's a dialogue can emerge in the country, because this is one way, because then our healthcare budgets don't need to go from 4% GDP to 8% GDP, right?
Correct.
Uska आधा % भी अगर preventive health में जाने लगे, तो the outcome can be ridiculously better.
Exactly. And I think, and absolutely right. And see, there are two fundamental problems. One is the incentives. Okay. So the incentives of the medical industrial complex, okay, is to in curative care, not preventive stuff. Okay. So that is that in the, and that's there in the US also, right? It's not just, let's not pick on India. Okay? It's there in the US and probably worse.
US में तो बहुत खराब है ना, तो हमारे लिए opportunity है वो कि वहाँ नहीं जाना है.
That we don't make those mistakes.
That's 20% GDP on healthcare में.
And outcomes, ghatia, okay, for that spending. Okay, it's just unreal. Okay. So that's a disaster of what you don't want to be. Okay? But there's another deeper problem, which is psychologically. Like, I mean, all of us, right? Like, you take health for granted when you have it, and you only think about health when you're sick. So, which means that the policy bias towards curative reflects the voter bias towards curative. Okay. So, this is where I think enlightened policy becomes especially important, right? Where you say, no, like as a government with scarce funds, this is what I need to invest in. I'll give you another example, right? The cost of pollution, okay, I mean, is so staggering, right? Just it is mind blowing, okay, how big it is, right? Now, but the way we think about our discourse on environment, it is positioned as a trade-off between environmental protection and jobs and investment. Okay, but the point is, if you look at the productivity consequences of air pollution, it is actually so strong that even from a productivity perspective, it makes sense to actually do the abatement. Okay, so the question is, the health ministry. This is one of these pathologies, okay? Often the best actions for improving population health are outside the health ministry because they might be sitting in roads. There's this beautiful study that showed how kind of building roads improves population health because people can access better care. Okay? Similarly, like you building broadband, okay, would have huge health benefits, right? But investing in preventive air pollution, like, has huge health benefits. But what the health department needs to do is be part of the conversation of environmental regulation to quantify and be the custodian of health in the government. But the health department functions as running the health system as opposed to thinking about population health. So some of this is kind of, once you say it, it's obvious. But it again reflects the fact that the government works in silos. And you have your job, which is to run. So most health secretaries think of their job as running the public health system. So there's so much low-hanging fruit, right? So in a world where 70% of kind of healthcare is private, you can get so much leverage by interventions to make markets work better. Okay, but we don't invest in information. We don't invest as much. So there are a lot of low-hanging fruit and ideas. But health to pura episode karna padega. Like, but I'm glad you are in the business of kind of fitness and preventive and, building that kind of, awareness. And, we need to do a lot.
But if that can happen at a national scale, right? I mean, this is the impact will be on a different level. And I think India genuinely has the opportunity.
Correct.
Because preventive health का best part है पैसा नहीं लगता उसमें.
बहुत कम लगता है.
Right? तो खाली लोगों को educate करना है, समझाना है और थोड़ा habit build करनी है. like, just you walk around for 10,000 steps. उसमें किसी का कुछ पैसा खर्च नहीं हो रहा है, कुछ सरकार से पैसा नहीं मांग रहा है. But awareness and motivation nudge.
And investing in like the few public spaces,
Right,
like in urban areas in particular, right?
That's
and from there make that possible.
Right.
Okay.
So Karthik, just coming to one more chapter, which is also very pertinent for India, is this whole, situation of jobs. Now, my understanding, every year we have about 12 million people who cross the age of 21, which means उनके कुछ need for employment, कुछ तो मतलब रोजगार चाहिए. Formal jobs are about 3 million or so per year. तो 9 million gap है. Now you can say ठीक है, उसमें 30-40% को शायद नहीं चाहिए या कुछ higher education, this, that, right? But still a sizable delta. So from your analysis, what is your characterization problem? कि क्या problem है job creation में और क्या solution है? खाली प्रॉब्लम के बारे में बात करने जाने में कुछ फायदा नहीं है. वो बहुत सारे लोग बात करते हैं.
नहीं, इसलिए हंस रहा हूँ क्योंकि मतलब वो सारी किताब में वो जो चैप्टर जो जॉब्स वाली चैप्टर इज प्रोबेबली वाज द हार्डेस्ट फॉर मी टू राइट बिकॉज इट इज ऑल ऑफ इकोनॉमिक्स.
एग्जाम का टाइम आ गया, पता है क्या करना है.
करना क्या. सो मतलब बैड न्यूज़ इज कोई सिल्वर बुलेट नहीं है, ठीक है. सो इन ऑल ऑफ दीज थिंग्स, राइट, it's like, sorry, I have to tell you a joke, right? Which is, so my first year PhD, okay, I'm taking a class with Greg Mankiw, who then went on to become chief economic advisor to President Bush, okay, CEA chair. And he's also written these very influential textbooks. Okay? So in the first lecture, he says, macroeconomics is a difficult subject. He said, you are confused and I'm confused. The difference is you are naively confused and I'm profoundly confused. Okay. So
jobs, you are profoundly confused.
No, so I think what I can offer, right, is a set of principles, right? That, let me say, there is no silver bullet, okay? But let us take a step back, right? There's no way to rush this, okay? Which is, see, at one level, we don't have a jobs problem because people in India can't afford to be unemployed. Okay? So the unemployment rate is actually very low.
तो अपना कुछ ढूंढ लेते हैं करने के लिए.
The problem is the quality of jobs, okay, which is kind of, it is not, am I working? I can't afford to not work, yeah. But I'm working in incredibly low productivity activities that don't generate much income. So how do you think about quality of job? So the most basic metric is what is the wage, right? The second is what is the predictability of the wage, okay? So if I'm in a daily spot labor, right, part of the challenge is not just care, matlab daily rozgar is not much, but I have no guarantee कि अगले दिन काम है, okay? So if you look at kind of the human cost of a spot labor market, right, where people don't even know if they're going to get a job that day, that is the uncertainty. And then obviously retirement benefits तो दूर की बात है, but even something like sick leave, okay? On a day when I'm sick, do I have some income, okay, to even kind of go through that day? So those are the things we want in terms of job quality, right? But providing better wages, and you're an employer, right? Providing better wages and better benefits cost money.
Yeah.
So you can only do that if the employee is adding more value than the cost, which means fundamentally the long-term driver of job quality is productivity. Right? It is productivity. So sometimes by focusing on jobs, I think we actually lose the plot because it's easy to say, oh, people are working. Okay. But, there is, I think, some naive report somewhere that says number of jobs have gone up. Okay. But that is because a lot of people have gone back to agriculture, which is kind of almost like a distress employment because kuch to chahiye aapko. But that is low productivity employment. That's not what you want as a country, right? So what you want as a country is how do you improve productivity? Because that's what then improves wages and improves job quality. And that's where growth comes. See, where does growth come from? Growth doesn't come from, say, I'm getting investment, Apple aa gaya, Foxconn aa gaya, growth aa gaya. Growth fundamentally happens from increasing productivity. It is, can the same individual produce more, right? That is where growth comes from, right?
Yeah.
And then let's go to the fundamentals. So where does growth come from, right? So at an economy level, it comes from two sources. There is factor mobilization, right? Which is we have land, labor, capital, right? Are we mobilizing factors and using them productively, okay? And the second key idea is productivity, right? How productive is each factor? Now, for high-income countries, most of the action is on productivity. Now, for a country like India, we can do a lot on both margins. Okay? So, when I say factor mobilization, right? So, I think I gave this example of how, for example, the quality of the judiciary, right, is so tightly linked to this because when you have a backlog of 30 million cases, okay, and if you look at the data, there's a large number of cases that are cases of land or credit, which means these are factors of production that are being locked out of production because they're under dispute. So you can accelerate productivity and growth by unlocking factors of production, right? So low female labor force participation. So then again, the connection between rule of law, public safety, right, and what that does. So that's why things like it was supposed to be one, it became 2 chapters, right? We skipped it. We didn't have time, but I'll take 1 minute. There's a whole chapter on police and public safety. There's a whole chapter on courts and justice, because these are critical public functions that then matter for jobs, which people don't make the connection, right? It matters for jobs, productivity, and economic growth, right? Because it's factor accumulation, okay? So one part of growth is factor accumulation. But the more important long-term path is then how do you take each worker and make him or her more productive? Again, and what are the factors that drive productivity, right? The first is education and skills, right? So that is the foundation, which is why, again, that's there. The second is kind of how much capital do I have, right? Am I using kind of the same worker with a better technology can do much more, right? And then there is a third, which is kind of the nature of the firm within which I'm operating, right? So if it's a well-managed firm, then every worker is delivering more output because you're better managed. Okay. So those are the fundamentals. Now, sometimes economies of scale. So scale is a good driver of productivity and comes for a variety of reasons. Okay. Now, why am I giving you this kind of Econ 101, right? Because you say at a macro policy level, right? You say, okay, everybody says, how many jobs have you created? But that's a very, very kind of not very productive way of thinking about it. Right? So as if you're making policy for the country and thinking at a state, national, strategic level, the core question you have to ask yourself are 2 things, right? Which is, how do I unlock factors of production that are being kind of locked from being productively used? Okay. So which is why quality of financial markets matters, right? We talked last time about RBI, gold, inflation. So a society that doesn't trust the banking systems, and is saving money in gold. So that is unproductive use of savings, because the gold preserves value from inflation, but that is not productively being used. Right?
Correct.
So that's in money in the formal financial system that's deployed to kind of a high ROI activity, which is going to generate more economic activity, right? So which is why, as economists, we focus more on what I call frictions rather than sectors. Okay, so a lot of the public discourse would say which sector should be attacked. Okay, whereas if you go to first principles as an economist, I'm basically saying that we need to unlock factors. So there's this beautiful work recently that was cited in the economic survey about how much of our productive land is lost due to building codes. Okay, so completely unglamorous subject. Okay, koi urban wala kahin building code kuch bana raha hai and using some manual from somewhere. Okay? But unless you kind of connect the dots between the building code and again loss factors, so these are all kind of low hanging fruit and plumbing. Okay, that will unlock factors of production. Okay? So long term, those are the things. So what are the things I'm recommending? Okay, so I'm saying that by focusing on frictions and by focusing on actions that help everybody. See, today what is happening? Most of our jobs agenda has become, how do I attract investments? Okay. And at this, because that is visible. Okay. Everybody wants to say, Acha, we got Qualcomm, we got Foxconn, we got Apple. And so at the national level, but it's also happening between states, right? So, and unfortunately, how are the states competing? They're competing on incentives. And that is again a zero sum, right? And it's a race to the bottom. So the fact that you're doing incentives itself is an indictment of your weak public goods, because the incentives are a band-aid or the deep flesh wound that you're not providing effective public services. Okay. Now the problem, I'm not saying we don't need the big marquee investors, okay, because they come with supply chains. There is a certain downstream value, like you get one big phone manufacturer, one big auto manufacturer. There's an element of industrial policy that makes sense. Okay. So I'm not saying don't do that.
No.
But what I'm saying is that is only scratching the surface of what we need, right? So there is so much more we need to do that is then about kind of thinking about productivity, right? And so, but then this is why the chapter between social protection and jobs is so tightly linked. Okay? Which again, people don't see, because one simple rule of thumb, okay, when you said what is a magic bullet? Okay, the closest I would say to a magic bullet, okay, for improving jobs and productivity is urbanization. Okay? So, and we need to think about urbanization as one of the biggest levers we have to accelerate productivity. Okay, and why is that? So, in the data, you'll see that average urban wages are probably double in rural areas. So what is the magic of cities? The magic of cities comes from multiple places. One, because you have scales, you have enough demand, okay, to kind of use your fixed factor, right? If you are kind of running a small shop in a village, half the time you're sitting twiddling your thumbs because koi customer nahi hai, right? So urban areas give you demand, so that gives you scale. Urban areas gives you kind of varieties. Urban areas gives you choice and competition, more accountability. So there are many fundamental reasons for why productivity in urban areas is higher. But the way we think about urban is almost like the urban development department in the government is saying, how do I manage my existing urban population? And they're trying to say, okay, Mirko, how do I just manage this? As opposed to strategically thinking about an urban mission to accelerate productivity. So what that chapter goes through is a whole bunch of first principles of how do you boost productivity,
Right.
Okay, because that is what will boost job quality, and then over time, a bunch of these things will take care. Now, there's a whole bunch of ideas, but if I had to say one or two big things, I would say this kind of obsessing on jobs per se is not very useful. Okay, because everybody's working. What matters is productivity.
So this is excellent. I think a lot of interesting food for thought, and I think the way, Karthik, you've written your book and how extensive research each chapter is. I think literally each chapter can be its own a mini book or mini episode in SparX, right? But I think we have covered a lot of ground. I think I want to end this episode on the note of first, very highly recommend this book. I think any of us who has interest in development of the country, developing nuanced understanding of why things are the way they are and what are the possibilities, I think it will trigger a lot of food for thought. I think one thing we didn't mention, you have 200 pages worth of references. I'm flipping through it. There are countless books and research papers that you have quoted, which is incredible amount of your contribution towards kind of engaging this dialogue and bringing all these ideas in a very accessible manner to common public, everybody from in fact policymakers to academicians to everyday common person who is just some interested in what is happening to a country. Perhaps how can I contribute towards that? So I'll just highly recommend this book. I think it's also very impressive, It makes you look very learned to have this on your bookshelf. But going through, you can either read the whole book or go through some chapters depending on your area of interest. I think you will find this is probably very ambitious and also very comprehensively done. So congratulations for that, Karthik. Wish you all the best for the book, and thanks so much for taking the time and talking to us.
Thank you. My pleasure. And again, thanks for creating this platform, for getting deep ideas out to a much broader audience. So thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks.
At SparX, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to SparX on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.